Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Barb Howe and I'm an instructor at USF, University of South Florida, and I teach INR 2002 Intro to International Relations. I made this video as an introduction to the last part of my course, the Global Issues section. It comes after we've spent 6 to 8 weeks talking about the major theoretical approaches in IR, that is realism, liberalism, constructivism, and the critical theories. So there are lots of videos out there on the web about those other topics, so I'm not going to explain them here, but it is helpful if you have at least a cursory understanding of them before you watch this video, because what I aim to do here is apply those theories to the broad concept of international security. I'm going to talk about how security has traditionally been thought about in international relations, and how new thinking, kind of new, past 30 to 50 years or so, let's say more recent thinking, has expanded the concept to much more fully reflect the entirety of the subject of security, or what we mean by security, not just for nation states, but for actual people. So if that sounds good, let's get started. I think a good place to start to think about what we mean when we talk about security and international relations is to step back and examine a hidden question that is contained within that phrase, international security. And that question is security for whom and security from what? Now, notice there's an invisible subject and object there. Who is the subject that is seeking security? And who or what is the threat that we are seeking to protect the subject from? So that question is there. And when we stop to think about it for a minute, it's very helpful to help us understand the nature of this concept that we call international security, and understand how it impacts our lives. So think about those two questions, security for whom and security from what, as I go ahead in the next slide and explain the two views or two concepts of security in international relations. Okay, so see, there are two dimensions to security in international relations. And for my students, I want you definitely to notice the different levels of analysis here. These are basically two different levels of analysis. On one hand, we have what is often thought of as like the traditional concept of security, and that is national security, or security for nation states. It is focused on protecting borders from incursions, usually military incursions, by other states. So we call that Westphalian sovereignty. My students will remember that from the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. The concept that nation states have a particular territory, and that territory, they have the right to defend that territory using their military. So the two theoretical approaches that are rationalist approaches, that is realism and liberalism, both agree that security is a thing and security is focused on the nation state. They don't question that. What they disagree about is just what is the best way to obtain security for the nation state. So, you have realism, remember, mostly focusing on militaries and military power. Now, there's a couple different camps of realism. There's offensive realism, which just argues that, your state should be gather as much power as possible, because really only the hegemon has true security. Those are the offensive realists. The defensive realists hedge that a little bit, and they say, well, actually, you don't quite want to get too much power, because if you do, that might make your neighbors nervous and then could set off an arms race, and then that decreases security for everybody. So, just a difference in tactics, or say a difference in strategy, but with the same goal of, protecting the borders of the nation state from a military incursion by another state. And then liberalism, as we know, has two things that it says increases security. One is economic interconnectedness, usually through trade, for example. And the other thing is strong international organizations. So international organizations that have the respect and power to help states resolve their differences before they get to that part of war. So those are the two things that liberalism emphasizes. Not that it discounts the other, but just says these are also important aspects for the security of nation states. So that's the realist and the liberalist, I say the rationalist theories approach to security in international relations. There is another approach, however, and that's, we can call that something called human security. In other words, security for people. So what's that about? So human security, of course, as the name implies, it has a focus on protecting the well-being of individuals. So you see there's that level of analysis. The other theories were focused on the level of the state. That's second level analysis. This is, human security is a first level of analysis. It's focused on individuals. And the main document for that is the 1994 UN Human Development Report, which laid out 7 different categories of human security. And as you can see, they're listed here. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. There's economic security, there's food security, health security, the right to have access to basic health care, environmental security, the right to have a healthy, non-polluted environment to live in. There's personal security, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more on the next slide. And there's community security, which is security for your group. Say if you are a member of a particular ethnic or religious group, you might be concerned about community security. And then finally, there's this other thing called political security, which is essentially just boils down to civil and political rights. Okay, so that's how that's just another way of thinking about security at a different level of analysis. So as I said, human security is all about people-centered security. Personal security basically equals human security. It's protecting your personhood. Beyond protecting civil and political liberties, like I said, those are called, political security. People also need personal security, security in their person, and they need this protection from 4 things. From their own state, for example, protection from physical torture by the state that they live in. They need this protection also from other states in the form of war, for example. They need protection of their personhood from other groups. So an example of that is like ethnic tensions or racially motivated violence, protection of your personhood by other groups who may target you. And also protection from other individuals. So, for example, rape, domestic violence, things like that. Those are all threats. All of these 4 are 4 threats to one's individual personhood. And that's what they mean by personal security. So human security is basically about making the world safe for people as both subjects and objects. And this is where I'm going to get back into that thing that I started with, as when we're thinking about that there's invisible subject and the invisible object in that question. Whose security? Security for whom? And security from what? That's the 2 invisible subjects and objects that are in that question of international security. And when we look at human security, it's just a way of getting us to be able to recognize and see, make those invisible things visible, bring them into the light. So that's what human security is all about. Okay, now here is where I'm going to get a little abstract on you again and bring us back to theory. Always, like I said, you just cannot get away from theory. It always comes back to theory. Specifically, I'm going to bring us back to Marx, because remember I said in class, Marx is kind of the origin point for all the various critical theories. And that's for a bunch of reasons that are too complicated to get into in this particular video. Maybe I'll do another one about it later. But for now, just remember that, all the critical theories can kind of trace their genealogy back to Marx and Marx's ideas. So the reason why this is relevant is because remember how I've explained that international relations is a political science. IR is a subfield of political science. There's 4 subfields. There's American government, there's comparative politics, there is political theory. For some reason, we separate that out in a weird sort of way, but of course, there's also a lot of theory in IR. So they're not really that separate. And anyway, 4th, we have international relations. So these are all subfields of political science. And political science, you will remember, is a social science, right? Our subject of study in this class is the social world of international relations. That's what the social sciences do. They study the social world, the world of humans, the world of human interactions, right? The world of how humans relate to one another. So the world of human relationships. Obviously, I'm not talking about, on an individual one-on-one, personal, intimate relationships, but relationships with each other in groups, basically. That is our subject of study. So in IR, we look at how those human interactions play out on a global scale. That is literally the subject of our academic field, right? So, funnily enough, that is what Marx was interested in too. Remember, I said in class that it might seem surprising to you when I say Marx was not interested in political emancipation. Absolutely not. He was very clear on this. It was almost a direct quote directly from one of his essays. He says, I am not interested in political emancipation. What I am interested in is human emancipation. So that's because he thought political emancipation was not enough. Political is only one small part of the whole entirety of human existence. And Marx thought it was too limiting to just focus on that one part. So he says, no, I'm going to step back and I'm going to talk about all of humanity, not just one part of humanity. Okay? So then we have to think, what does this mean about how Marx thinks about humans? What does Marx think humans are? Right? And so he goes into this quite explicitly, and that's where he has that weird term that I mentioned in class called species being. What the heck does that mean, right? Well, all it means is it was his term for the thing that makes us different as a species from all other species. So the thing that makes us, and it goes beyond being conscious. It goes beyond, using tools. Of course, we know lots of animals use tools. What is it that makes us different from all other species? That is our species being. So think of it as basically this. Marx is talking about species being is essentially that which is quintessentially human in us, the thing that sets us apart from all other animals on the planet. That's what species being is. So Marx is talking about this idea of species being and human emancipation because he thought political emancipation was just one small part of that. And what we really need to do is think about human emancipation, the way to be the most free we can possibly be as human beings. That's what he was interested in, human emancipation. So you see how that idea is kind of reflected in the 1994 Declaration of Human Security, where it had political security listed, but it's just one of many aspects of human security. That's what we're talking about. That's my example. Now, Marx went on to talk about how labor in a capitalist system alienates us from our species being. I'm not going to get into that here. That's for another lecture, another day. But what I do want to do is draw your attention to the emphasis that Marx put on human relationships. He puts a lot of emphasis on human relationships. In fact, so much human relationships, our relationships with other people, is so important to Marx. It basically forms the basis for his entire philosophy, his understanding of how the world works, the nature of the world. That's how much emphasis Marx puts on human relationships, human interactions with other humans. The world is basically built off of this foundation of human social interaction, right? Now that starts to make sense. I know my students are thinking like, oh, we've heard this before. She's said many times the social world is a world made up of human relationships. It's a world made up of ideas, right? Yeah, this is starting to sound familiar. This is how those theories get applied to the world. Now we talked about what that means, the idea that the social world is made up of or constituted by ideas, what that means for methodology, for how we go about studying the thing that we study. We're studying the social world, and we're also part of that social world. We talked about how it's impossible to remove ourselves from the picture and study the world from, say, the God's eye point of view, that is, removed from the social world, that's objectively an entirely neutral position. This idea comes from Marx, that we cannot do that because we are both subject and object in this endeavor right now. What's the endeavor? The endeavor is understanding the human world. That's the endeavor. In this endeavor, we are both subject and object. So like in my example here with human security or with international security, we have to ask security for who and security from who. We are both subject and object in that question, right? I know, I warned you, I told you it's going to get a little bit trippy. It's getting very abstract, but bear with me just a little bit longer. Okay, so Marx basically thinks human relationships are so important. They basically structure everything else in society, okay? And since we are both subject and object, we are the ones doing the studying, and we are also the ones being studied, both at the same time. And this has implications for methodology, for the way we carry out social science. What it also means, though, is that all knowledge comes from somewhere. As you see this quote here, it's one of my favorite quotes. It's by this guy named Robert Cox, 1981. He wrote this article, and he had this beautifully simple sentence, so simple, but so much contained in it. It says, theory is always for someone and for some purpose. Robert Cox is a Marxist. You could see that, right? So for Marxists, all knowledge is historically contingent. What does contingent mean? Contingent's just a fancy word meaning it depends on something else, right? Like I can go out tonight. My going out tonight is contingent on my getting all of my work done, right? So it's going out is contingent on getting my homework done. That's all it means. But it's a very important word because people use it a lot when talking about these theories. So it's important that you understand what it means. They say all knowledge, Marx says, all knowledge is historically contingent. That is, it is affected by where we are in that web of social relationships that we have with other people. You see? Isn't that amazing? It is all of our knowledge about the world, because we are both subject and object, all of our knowledge of the world comes from where we stand in that web of human relationships. Like I said, human relationships, it's so important to Marx that it forms the basis of his entire understanding of the world, of how the world works. And that's something that, one of the things that critical theory gets from Marxism. Like I said, the other one is that normative position. Marx had that famous quote where he says, the point is not to interpret the world, the point is to change it. That's the other thing that the critical theories take from Marxism. But this first one is this idea of the contingency of all human knowledge, contingent on our social position. So often that means our position in history, when we live. For example, think about, people who lived in different times and eras in history, where they lived in different countries and different parts of the world, maybe what religion they are, all of these things, whether they were a worker or an owner. That's the main relationship that Marx says it's like the most important relationship. That's his class division. He talks about the bourgeoisie, the owners, and then the proletariat, the workers. Just this really simple, basic, there's only two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the relationships that the people that live in those particular categories, the fact that they're in those categories, that structures their relationships with the other category and with each other. And those relationships basically influence all of the social world. Now, other critical theories came along after, and they said, well, we're going to, tweak that a little bit. They critique this idea that, it all just comes down to class. And the other critical theories, expanded upon that idea. And they say, well, it's also the concept of race or the concept of gender, for example, or, the history of colonialism, post-colonial theory, the concept of heteronormativity. All of these different critical theories, they may change which particular social relationships they're focusing on in order to help us see different things. But it all comes back to that Marxist idea that human relationships with other humans forms the basis of the social world. That's all it is. That's the influence of Marx. And since we are in this class, of course, studying the social world, this is really important. This has a lot of implications for how we understand something like international security. What does that mean? Security for whom? Security from what? Our ideas about where we exist, our ideas about those things, how we answer those questions depends on where we exist in those social relationships, our particular. So we say our knowledge is historically contingent. And that's why, remember, we talked about that term positionality. Like we position ourselves, and that's why we say, this is where I am in this web of human relationships, because it matters, you see? So because it matters. So that's the main thing that the critical theories take from Marxism. And it's a really important idea. And you can see how important it is. It has huge ramifications for how we do social science, So it's not anything at all about necessarily ideology, like in the sense of like, the Soviet Union. You can see how that's just like, this is not even really Marxist. It was a totally different thing. Well, it was Leninist. But you can see how this idea, step back away from politics. Remember, Marx says, I'm not interested just in the politics side. I'm interested in the human side. And you can see how expansive his ideas were. They're really very, very huge. So that's basically my point in this slide. Sorry for the cat. So just one more point that I forgot to make in that last slide, which I know was very dense, but I wanted to circle back to that quote from Robert Cox, right? Theory is always for someone and for some purpose. So that social embeddedness, we can call that idea that we are all situated within that web of human relationships. We can call that idea social embeddedness. That social embeddedness is why Marx and other critical theorists believe that no knowledge of the world is neutral or objective, because it is always embedded within that web of human relationships. And that makes sense, right? You can see how, the knowledge of Christopher Columbus was a particular knowledge from a particular place for a particular purpose. That's going to be very different from the knowledge of somebody living today, for example, or somebody living like 100 years ago, say W.E.B. Du Bois, for example. His knowledge is going to be knowledge from a particular person, from a particular place, in a particular historical context, and it's going to be radically different from the knowledge of Christopher Columbus. And both of those are going to be radically different from the knowledge of someone like me, positioned where I am in these social relationships. So that's what Robert Cox meant by theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And then I'll also remind my students again with this idea that I opened the semester with by telling you about those 3 important dates in international relations. And the first one was 1919, when the field of international relations was invented. And why was it invented? It was invented as a response to World War I. As we're going to study war so that we can prevent it. That's what it's talking about. It's a theory. In this case, it's our entire academic discipline that was invented at a particular time for a particular purpose by particular people. So that's not a bad thing to say that about something. It's not saying that it's necessarily bad. It's just saying that's just how it is. It's impossible for us to have a knowledge of the world that is not located in a particular time or a particular place. That would be what I call the God's eye view. That's the God position. We cannot get there. We are not God. We are humans. We are both subject and object in the social world. We are both part of the thing we are studying, and we are the ones doing the studying. So because of that, all of our knowledge of the world is socially contingent. That is dependent on our particular location in that web of social relationships that Marx thought was so important. So that was my last point. So you can see this is what happens when you question assumptions and theories. This is what happens when you question some basic concepts, such as what do we mean by security? Security for who? Security from what? And why? And suddenly there are whole new worlds that open up to us, that things that we never even saw before, that we never even saw under those rationalist theories, because we weren't questioning those assumptions. We weren't questioning security for who, or from what, and why. What does liberation mean? So you can see how a concept, you can even question a concept like liberation, or as Marx put it, emancipation. And you can ask, what does that mean? What does it mean to be free? And you might, like Marx, you might even get to the point where you're probing what it means to be human. And then suddenly everything changes. Everything opens up. So I picture Alice falling through the rabbit hole. Remember how she's falling really slowly through the rabbit hole, and it's really dark in there, but then she starts to make out, as her eyes adjust to the darkness, she starts to make out that there are all these doors in the walls of the rabbit hole, that she didn't see those before. That's what critical theories do. They point out those hidden doors. And if you go through those doors, if you question some of these assumptions that the rationalist theories don't question, then you might end up in new and wonderful places. You might end up rethinking how to think about the social world, rethinking what security means, rethinking what human means, rethinking what international relations means. And my last point that I wanted to make today is to talk a little bit more about post-structuralism, because I had a couple of students ask me for more information about that. And I have this video clip here because I think it's such a great it's such a great example of post-structuralist analysis, and it comes from a movie from 1958. Can you imagine? It's brilliant. It's absolutely wonderful. Now, I can't play it here because of copyright, but I will put a link that you can click on. You can watch it later. But remember that post-structuralism is one of the critical theories. It's a critical theory that focuses on language and how language shapes our ideas about the social world. So in this scene, I'll set this up for you. So in this scene, this is Tony Curtis talking to Sidney Poitier. It's from a movie called The Defiant Ones. They're both escaped prisoners, and they're literally handcuffed together. So they have to make their way through the world together. And Tony Curtis's character is really, really racist. You can see that in this clip. And the two characters are talking about the labels, the things that we call one another, especially the things that people used back then to call people of other races. And Tony Curtis's character says, "I didn't make up that word," and Sidney Poitier says, "No, you just use it." And I think, God, isn't that the best line ever? No, you just use it. You use the language. So in other words, you perpetuate the system. It doesn't matter who thought it up. What matters are our actions today. How our actions today either reinforce the status quo, they either reinforce the existing power relationships, or they challenge those existing power relationships. In other words, they act subversively to undermine them. That's what Marx meant by revolution, really. Human emancipation. Right? Using language, well, he didn't talk about language so much. That comes later. Like I said, it's post-structuralist theory. But that idea that post-structuralists say, your language can either support the existing power structures or it can undermine it. So it's not so much about well, I'll just leave it at that. Our language, the way we talk about the world, influences the way we think about the world, and we can either not question those things, in which case we go through life like Tony Curtis here, and we just say, well, I didn't make the unjust social structures in this world, it's not my fault. But if we keep doing it, we just perpetuate them. And so that's I don't think we should feel guilty about, the creation of those unjust social structures, because we didn't create them. What we should feel guilty about is perpetuating them. So that's what post-structuralism is like. That's what critical theory, and that's what critical theory, also another thing that critical theory takes from Marxism is that normative idea of, like that famous quote from Marx. The point is not to just interpret the world. The point is to change it. So the explicit normative stance the critical theories take. That's another debt that they owe to Marxism. So, yeah, I have one more slide and then I'll wrap it up. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful to you to not only introduce the concept of international security in an intro to international relations course in a college class, but also to help students see how theories work, how theories are applied in real life, and what they do. They help us understand the world in various ways. And it's always important to remember that, like Robert Cox said, theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And so if we might want to sometimes question those and find theories from other people that are for other purposes in order to expand our knowledge about how the social world works. So I think that's really important. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them down below. I'll try to get back to you as time permits. And thank you very much.